Hey everybody, Dr. C here. I am making a video going over chapters 11 and 12, specifically reality theory and feminist theory. We are asynchronous a lot of the times, and a couple of you pointed out that it's really helpful to have some extra means of support even when we are virtual and asynchronous and we don't get to meet. So I hope that this video is helpful for you guys. So we're going to dive into chapter 12 first. So I just am looking at the PowerPoint, and you guys can follow along with me on that as well. So when we look at choice theory, right, that's synonymous with reality theory. There's certain things we want to highlight that really signifies like what the point of this approach has and what it offers specifically. The chapter talks about the theoretical underpinnings, of course. We're going to explore behavior and how important it is that behavior is examined in the here and now, and that realistic and that reality in regards to every decision is made because somebody has a choice to do so, and understanding our choices and how it led us to this point can be helpful in increasing insight and awareness. And then we're going to go over the associated models with that too. So reality therapy, it really provides a delivery system for helping individuals take more effective control of their lives. Reality therapy is a fantastic choice and option for working with individuals that have a really hard time feeling like they're in control of their life. You may prefer to take a reality or a choice theory approach when you're working with someone who's got mild to moderate depression or even anxiety, because it can help instill feelings of confidence when we break down the decisions and choices that are in front of us. Some key concepts associated with this are really examining behavior and the root motivation for making these changes. So the book talks about survival, love and belonging, power, freedom, and fun, and how these are basic encoded needs that all of us have. We have a need to survive. We have a need to love and belong, to have power, to have freedom, and to have fun. And what's interesting about choice theory, and we'll use that term synonymously with reality theory, is that it is really building off of like the previous theories that we've talked about, right? Thinking even back to psychodynamic, going back into survival. Then we're getting into some attachment themes with love and belonging. And then we're talking about freedom and power, which has echoes of person-centered within it. And so reality theory, while it is very much present focus, looking at our behavior here and now, it's important to know where it's coming from and the things that it's been built off of. Furthermore, reality theory looks at the world and has different like classifications, and it's specifically the term associated with these specific ways, the quality of how the world exists is that like photo album idea. So the quality world consists of visions of specific people, activities, events, beliefs, situations, and all of my life experiences, collectively speaking, with those things give me like this mental photo album of who I am and what I can do, right? Looking at my beliefs, my faith, my religion, my family, my culture, my hobbies, right? That all of those things create this, the term that we're using, that photo album, that gives me insight to who I am. And so getting into the client's quality world, right? That's the art of the therapy. That's a big important feature when you're using reality and choice theory, is that before we start talking about making different decisions and making different choices, we've got to understand where the client's coming from and understand what has led to this point, specifically knowing this photo album. So when we look at choice theory's explanation of behavior, one point that the book makes is that you can mistakenly choose misery when you're actually trying to help yourself. And That may sound odd at first, right? But I think about that in terms of perhaps even some uh, self-harm examples where a lot of individuals who experience self-harming behaviors, they don't wake up and decide to hurt themselves. They don't wake up and decide they want to be in pain. Most often, individuals experiencing urges to self harm are already living with so much pain inside of them. Or the opposite extreme, right? Severe feelings of numbness and detachment, where the act of self harming, whether it's cutting, burning, hitting, whatever it might be, even starvation, eating disorders, things like that, the act of self harm is soothing in some ways, at least in the moment. In long term, it creates a lot of chaos and misery, so to speak, following the choice theory model. But originally, that choice made in the moment was to assist, to help the self, right? And so, using a choice theory mindset, we would work with a client that experiences, moderate to mild severe forms of like self-harm behaviors or self-injurious behaviors. And we would talk about the choices and the decisions that led to that moment. And most of the time, different negative beliefs about the self are going to come up, ways the client is thinking or feeling that's negative about themselves. And when you can start to identify those specifically, we got some cognitive vibes going on there. It can really help emphasize personal responsibility on the end of the client that can give them freedom, going back to one of those core beliefs from reality theory. It can give them the freedom to act different and to make different choices. So building right along here, I'm going to turn because I've got a funky glare going on my computer. That's a little bit better. Building off of that, reality theory looks at a few other points in contingent with that: the doing, the thinking, the feelings, and the physiology. Looking at explaining behaviors, the doing is what I'm actively doing in the here and now. What are the things, what are the behaviors, what are the actions that I am in this moment doing, right? And you can utilize like a very almost like Gestalt present-based way of understanding like the client's insight to what their behavior is. Same with thinking, feelings, and physiology. Physiology is important, especially going back to the self-harm examples. If you have a client that is, let's say, has major depression and they've utilized self-injury behaviors such as cutting in the past, we will explore together the physiological reaction that our body has when we cut. Because sometimes it can be more euphoric and it can, in the moment provide that soothing sensation. But long term, physiologically speaking, there's pain associated with it. So that's a good example to think about the doing. I'm actively cutting myself. When I'm cutting myself, here's what I'm thinking, here's what I'm feeling, here's how my body reacts, and here are the ways that I can shift that to be more effective for me long term. It goes with the name that the major characteristics of reality therapy looks at emphasizing the person's responsibility and the choice that they have, and how it's not easy by any means, but it can be more simplistic in nature to conquer a challenge or to cope with a disorder or to cope with a trauma when we emphasize the choice that an individual has. Reality therapy also rejects transference. It focuses on keeping the present-based tense in a session, right? The here and now that we're talking about. We are not focusing very much on symptoms as much as we're focusing on behaviors. So even thinking about the self-injury, right? That can be a symptom that some people experiences, but it would paint it more in terms of this was a choice you made, this was an action. And it challenges the traditional views of mental illness that can be pretty demeaning and keep individuals from healing and focusing on different things. The primary goal of utilizing this form of therapy focuses on getting the client connected or reconnected to the world, to the quote unquote quality world, going back to that photo album, right? It helps clients learn more effective ways to meet their needs and fulfill them, to prioritize them, to have healthy forms of control and power in their life, to have some independence, right? And then, of course, to have fun. So, the main points we covered earlier kind of transfer over here when we were talking about the view of human nature, right? The survival, love and belonging, power, freedom, fun. Those are all things that therapy focuses on targeting to increase. The book talks about better ways to fulfill, better ways to do those things. I sometimes utilize, not better, but more effective, more helpful, more healthy, more advantageous, more adaptive ways. That language is important, I feel, when it comes to working with clients that have working with clients when utilizing this form of therapy. When we talk about actually applying it to a case or actively applying it to an individual that you're working with, there's really two things you want to keep in mind. The first one is that you create the counseling environment, you build that rapport, you are able to, again, understand the photo album before trying to change it. You support, right? You challenge, non-coercively speaking. Challenging a client in their ways of thinking and being can be intimidating at first, especially for a new counselor. But it's imperative that you challenge the ineffective ways of thinking and the unhealthy thought cycles, perhaps, that are originating from the client. This is really evident in depressed clients and clients that have mood disorders or thought disorders, that there's a lot of rigidity in thinking. And so being able to find ways to challenge that way of thinking in a way that's still empathic is critical. And then part two is that you implement specific procedures that lead to changes in behavior. And that's looking at the WDEP system, system. So the W stands for, you guessed it, the wants, the needs, the perceptions, the views of the self. What do you want to do? What do you want to be? That's why for a lot of clients, when I choose this approach or I have a reality focus or I bring it into our space together, rather than asking them to explore or talk about who they are, that can be not so good for clients that have complex trauma or have depression and are struggling to cope, is that the view of themselves in the here and now is not so great. It can be very demeaning. So instead I ask who you want to be or who you envision yourself being or who you know you can be. It's a way that helps the client, escape from that view of self, right? Thinking about who they can be in the moment. It's still present based. It's just envisioning your ideal self in the here and now versus your ideal self in 5 years. I think that's the important differentiation between the two. And so bringing that even more present based, you say, okay, well, what are you doing? What can we do in the here and now to actively work towards that? And then we'll do that evaluative component, that E, right? Does your present behavior have a reasonable chance of getting you what you want, right? So if I'm working with that same client who's got some self-injury behaviors going on and they utilize it as a way to cope with their feelings of sadness in the moment, and we have a goal together to decrease depressive symptoms, but long-term we see that action increases it because then we just feel guilty and shameful, which those are two emotions that can be very significant in depression and can keep the depressive cycle going, is feelings of guilt and shame. And then you withdraw even more because you don't want to go out in public because of the scars that you have. And so again, like if I'm self-evaluating at this phase, I'll start to recognize, that's not going to help me work towards my goals. So what are some other things that I can do instead? And that's when we get to the planning phase. It's that long acronym again, that SAMIC, which, at this planning and action phase, it's really another iteration of SMART goals, right? Things that are simple, creating a plan of action that's attainable, that we can measure, that is immediate, that we can start now. That's very important because, living with depression and related experiences, motivation can come and go. A lot of us don't have motivation. So being able to do it in therapy together can be really effective because, the thinking is I did it in therapy today, I can do it at home. And then it's controlled by the planner, it's consistently done, and you're committed to it. So really echoing these themes of ownership, right? That's very central to reality and choice theory. This is really effective in group counseling. I've utilized this before with many different types of skills groups. Even DBT commonly utilizes that to a degree in different modules. It helps meet different needs of a group as well, and it allows the group to see their experience mirrored by members or a different experience altogether that they can relate to, even though they may not go through the exact same thing, that we can all still create healthy goals that can get us to where we want to go. So where we are coming from may be different, but where we want to go is the same. And creating, right, going back to that sense of love and belonging in a group can be a way to really improve mental health challenges. So there are some strengths and weaknesses in utilizing this approach from a multicultural perspective. Going over the strengths with you guys, the therapist demonstrates just like inherent respect for the client, irregardless of their background and their culture, because it is saying, like, I, the therapist, I'm not coming up with these goals. I'm not saying that these behaviors are or aren't certain things. That's the client's job. However, forgive me moving around so much, just trying to get a little comfortable. That's the client's job. The client is the one who gets to say, oh yeah, this is helpful for me, this isn't helpful. And then the therapist is the one who can add input as needed with that. Respect, right, is really central here too, because it's a sign of respect that the therapist refrains from giving opinion and feedback based on what behavior should be changed. Culturally speaking, who am I to say that this certain behavior isn't healthy and another is? That really needs to come from the client's perspective. And then with a focus on thinking and acting rather than exploring feelings, many clients are less likely to display resistance. So I know that a lot of us, or I'll speak for myself, I tend to lean more towards an emotion-focused perspective, but I absolutely see the benefits of utilizing choice theory and reality therapy because it offers a different type of therapeutic dimension. There is challenging going on, like we talked about, but not in the way that occurs with an emotion-focused perspective. When you utilize choice theory, you're almost like little scientists sitting together, but you get to decide what, the client gets to decide what they want to specifically label as unhealthy or ineffective. Whereas in emotion-focused work, you're leaning more towards identifying the emotion that's coming up for you, what it means for you, where it's coming from, the story of it, the narrative, where that originated from. Choice theory is much more based in the here and now. It's not as important where it came from. What's more important is where we're going to go and where you want to go and where we can go today together. The principle underlying choice theory is universal, talking about the love and belonging, the power, the independence, the desire to even have fun. Those are reflecting some basic primary emotions that can surpass cultural groups in a lot of ways. Reality therapy is an open system that allows for flexibility in its application because, again, it's coming from the client. The therapist is not necessarily the expert in the room as much as they are the guide and the supporter and the assistant. Because, I'm not saying as the therapist what behavior needs to be changed. That's coming from the client. So in and of itself, with just that point, it can be effective for different cultural groups too. And then the main principles and concepts can be incorporated in a dynamic that's more personal or non-personal. There's a basis for integrating these concepts with most of the other therapeutic approaches. I even talked earlier about how I can utilize choice theory and reality therapy effectively, even maintaining a more emotion-focused or psychodynamic lens, because it offers relief from the deep level of insight and like ego consciousness work that we may be doing. It kind of pairs nicely with it. It's like, when you go out to eat, pairing a nice steak with a glass of wine, right? It may be totally opposite, of the actual, what you're eating in the moment, but it pairs nicely because it offers relief. It's like a palate cleanser of sorts. Not saying that one is better than the other, but that they offer different things. The therapy, this type of theory, it really gives limited attention to helping people address environmental and social issues. And so that certainly can be a shortcoming from a diversity perspective. Some critics talk about how it's not paying enough attention to these systemic and environmental factors. And in and of itself, that limits choice. Because society, my environment, my culture may be limiting me as a result of being different, as a result of coming from a different background. And so no amount of choice understanding or reality understanding can change a system, is sort of the argument there, which has some validity. And some clients are very reluctant to verbally and directly express what they need. Some may not know how, which is where I like to use this pairing with an emotion-focused work that allows a client to sit with the needs and even think about what those needs are, where they're coming from, and then building accordingly to get to a point where we can talk about where we want to go, right? Where we can explore more of that. It has a relative short-term focus, right? Because you're like breaking down behaviors and changing a behavior. It can take time, but it also gives us constant like levels to check into when it comes to progress. The existential underpinnings of choice theory are a major strength of the approach when we're looking at feelings of love and belonging, of survival. And it can help accentuate that idea of personal responsibility for what we're doing. And that is very critical, like we said, in a lot of different mental health experiences. That's what's really hard about like the depressive cycle, is that we can feel totally out of control of our depressive symptoms. Or if I'm living with some type of psychosis, I can feel out of control on, my experience, on my hallucinations, on my delusions. But if I'm utilizing some choice theory in a session with a client that has a psychosis, for example, we can talk about how the daily things we do, right, such as what we eat or ingest, or our wellness, like exercise, getting out and about, how we can make certain choices that can help us over time and not cure or get rid or fix our psychosis or depression, but certainly aid and help in managing not just the symptoms, but meeting specific needs apart from living with psychosis, right? So it may not even be focusing directly on the symptomology as much as it's focusing on the other aspects, the other needs, the needs that aren't being met in my life, perhaps directly or not directly related to the symptoms. It's very empowering. A sense of self-direction can come from it as well. Reality theory is very effective for individuals who have this really hard relationship or challenging relationship with change, and can be a bit more ambivalent in nature, which again is like pretty characteristic of depression and depressive related disorders. And it's really helpful for addiction treatment and recovery. We talked about its use with groups. That's commonly used for addiction recovery groups. And then the same is true for individual work. Some limitations building off of the shortcomings we talked about earlier. It does not give a lot of focus to, that insight, to dreams, to transference, to, the therapeutic relationship as much as other theories do. More empirical support is needed for it because it is a very here and now sequential based type of work together, type of theory. We need to have a bit more understanding on what it's best used for. I think it's really effective for clients, like I said, that are mild to moderately depressed, severely depressed, or kind of on the more severe side of the spectrum. I'm hesitant to utilize it there. I think it could be used when symptoms are relieved a little bit and a client is feeling a little bit more in control. And then recalling, supporting, sharing, getting into dreams can help the client more, and this theory just doesn't dive into that. So just keep that in mind. And when used ineffectively, some therapists even impose their opinions on, we just highlighted a while ago how the therapist should not do that, right? But sometimes, therapists do that, unfortunately, where we impose our beliefs and feelings about an action, and that does create challenges in any type of therapeutic dynamic when the therapist is the one deciding what changes. Because if I'm deciding it, then long term, that's not going to be effective for the client because it didn't come from them. They're not going to care. Or I should say, they're not going to be as invested as they would be if it was coming from them. It's hard enough when it's coming from them because it's a behavior. Behavior is hard to change, let alone if you don't want to change it. And so to effectively practice it takes a lot of practice and supervision and continuous learning, as research also, follows suit with that. So that's choice theory. Building off of that, we're going to dive into feminist therapy, which is always a super fun one to talk about. All right. So when we talk about feministic therapy or feminist counseling, psychotherapy, the perspective, very similar to person-centered approach, the idea of this is that it's a worldview. It's not just a way to approach therapy, but it's an actual way to just see the world and to live in it, right? Building off of like how person-centered is too. And so this theory is highly focused on the social, cultural, and the socio-political climate as well, and how that informs mental health and how that informs challenges that individuals are going through, because it's very systemic in that way. It's focusing on the many different systems. That's feministic counseling. So feminist psychotherapy, again, that's a philosophy orientation that lends itself to integrating multiculturalism, social justice things, as well as a feministic approach. And then building off of it, really defining a feminist perspective. It's a unique way to understand the role that women and men have with the different social identities and experiences. And that's something we're going to break down, that feminist theory is not just for working with women. It is a way of viewing all the genders in this sort of way. So unlike the other theories, there's no single creditor to the inception, right, when it comes to it. No single individual is deemed the founder. It's more collaborative in those who have built on it, which in my mind sort of adds to like what the point of feminist theory is more holistically looking at these systems in place in the individual and the parts, right, of the world. And that's like just echoed in its founding. Even though like the beginnings of feminism, that the first wave is traced all the way back to the late 1800s. The women's movement of the 1960s is what we refer to as the second wave feminism. And that really laid the foundation for approaching it like in a therapeutic context. So some important concepts together is, first and foremost, the gender fair approach. And that's explaining the differences between behavior of men and the behavior of women, and building on how equity and equality should and can exist and needs to continue to be pursued and discovered in that same vein. We look at that the flexible multicultural perspective that can apply equally to individuals and groups, saying like, this is a basic need, we can pursue this together. The interactionist view is specific to thinking, feeling, behaving dimensions. And then lastly, the lifespan perspective assumes that human development is a lifelong process. So it is more like a developmental approach. It's more long-term, longitudinal, that this is constantly moving. This theory doesn't have an end per se, but we can always become more aware on these like different ways that society, culture are impacting individuals, especially of minority genders. When we look at the feminist perspective on personality development, the societal gender role expectations is very profound in the work of a feminist theorist, meaning that even before a person's born, the impact that society can have and demand on the self or on the child who's about to be born. Gilligan, 1977, that's a researcher your book talks about, dives into the development of women, was originally normed on male expectations, and how the things that women socially and societally are conditioned to do were in direct relation to what a man was not doing or couldn't do or shouldn't do. And so that already has some power inequity implications, right? Meaning that one is over the other, at least in terms of specific tasks, and saying that the way to be, this is just kind of the logical underpinnings of this theory, is that in order to be a woman, in order to be a woman in society, right, what has been the history was that I had to live under the expectations and sort of like goals set by the opposite gender. And so that can be very limiting when it comes to experiences of sexism and internalized and externalized oppression alike. The main principles of this therapy and of this theory, the personal, political, connection, really examining politics from what are the things that our society, right? Because we live in a society that at the moment has leadership over individuals, right? Or as some say, for the people rather than over the people. That these policies, these laws, these regulations in place, we need to maintain a critical lens, a feministic lens, to aid in creating equity that has long since been ignored, right? That's the feminist approach. And it's quite central to it to be aware, to have insight into these things, into what they're doing. Those who practice it are committed to social change. That, again, like going back to the long-term longitudinal perspective, like it is ever moving, ever growing. It's always can be pursued more. And women and girls' voices and ways of knowing, and the voices of others who have been oppressed or valued. And so a common stereotype for feminist theory is that it quote unquote only cares about women. However, maintaining a feministic approach is more about creating and viewing equity and pursuing equity and equality and fairness and justice in all groups, right? In all ethnic groups and all minority groups, whether that's gender minority, sexual minority, both, religious minorities. It's really just giving extra support and focus to that specifically. The counseling relationship is egalitarian, right? We're on equal footing here. That seems pretty like fundamental, right? Is that even in therapy, we want to pursue equity together and a sense of fairness and justice in our space. Feminist theory focuses on strengths, and that's very important. It's very strength-based, looking at these different types of minority experiences and reformulating definitions of psychological distress in a way that's less demeaning towards those same minorities that are oftentimes left unsupported historically and today. The example that comes to mind is, with certain types of personality disorders, it was commonly, women who were depressed were commonly referred to as hysterical for a long time, all because they were feeling overwhelmed with everything they had on their plate, so to speak. And when a woman, just thinking historically, would have a mental breakdown or would have a depressive episode, they were immediately labeled as just silly, right? Just crazy, just hysterical. And we even fight in the psychology space, like to raise awareness on like being aware how many genders are disproportionately, or what genders are disproportionately diagnosed with a condition. For example, histrionic personality disorder is almost exclusively only diagnosed in women. Major depression is pretty similar. Bipolar disorders, borderline personality disorder, those are diagnosed in women significantly more than men. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that, yet we want to look at the why there. And that's really what feminist theory enhances conversation on, is understanding the why and how all types of oppression are recognized. Again, not just with specific genders, but like even with minority groups as a whole. So what does this look like in therapy? Becoming more aware of your view of society, right? Bringing up awareness on your biases is integral before entering into the therapeutic space. When I'm in the therapeutic space, having done that and continuously doing that, I want to become aware of the client's views of gender, role socialization, and things that they have been socialized to do that maybe they endorse or maybe they don't endorse. And it's important to separate the differences between the two. Identifying ways that they may be internally oppressing themselves, or I guess what would be more accurate to say is that they've internalized the messages of oppression. I can't apply for that job. Like I'm the only woman in the office. I can't apply for that promotion. I'm not going to get it anyways. And then I would want to work with that client and talk about, well, why do you feel that your gender holds you back at work? What have been experiences that you felt singled out as being the only woman? Has that happened? Are you the one saying that? Who are others saying that? How does that look? Talk to me about ways that you have felt marginalized in that environment. And so identifying that can be helpful. And then replacing it with a more self-enhancing view. Well, some would say that because you are the quote unquote only woman there, that you offer something different, you offer a unique perspective and opinion that the other coworkers may not. And so learning to focus on the strengths, right? That is a critical component of the therapeutic process. Understanding how sexism, oppressive societal beliefs look within that, and navigating that is crucial. That can last, I mean, like years of therapy, right? Because there's always something to explore in regards to how society impacts and oppresses specific individuals, and bringing awareness into that conversation. We look at skills, right? So you being a feminist theorist, it focuses on enhancing skills that the client can have to change their environment, at least the environment that they have ability to change and impact. And again, it's very similar to like choice theory. It's all coming from the client, not from my perspective on what feminist theory should be. It, like we said earlier, those who are feminist theorists are very focused on social change as well. And so we are always advocating for restructuring of institutions to identify and get rid of discriminatory practices, and bringing up ways that we can support those who have been historically and continue to be unsupported, in ways that it's not just equitable, but like also assists in making up for the deficits that were experienced prior to, social justice became cool. It's much more than just a fad. It's a way of thinking and being, and that's what really sticks out to me with this theory. And similar to choice theory, it helps develop a sense of power and control in healthy ways, and it builds trust within their intuition and experience. And you can see how effective that can be for someone who for a long time felt discredited because of their identity, because of their gender. They felt that, they may have been told, and probably were told, that their voice didn't matter because of who they were. Whereas feminist theory does the exact opposite. It enhances those voices. It enhances and supports those voices. It doesn't give voice to, they already have voices, but it enhances the voice that they have and just provides a encouraging environment to speak up for the self. So when we talk about assessment and diagnosis, this is also an important point, is the theory is that diagnoses are based on the dominant culture's view of what's normal and not normal. And so a lot of feminist theorists are pretty critical on diagnoses and assessment of any kind. And I kind of get it because, historically speaking, at least when it comes to the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, when you look at its inception, who's a part of it, the American Psychological Association, and the dominant cultural group that it is like the entity that it is, you just always want to be aware of, we're making decisions because we're told something. We're making diagnoses that can be very impactful for a person's wellness in their life. We want to know where that diagnosis is coming from. What's it being normed on? Are we just going back to my hysteria example, are we just utilizing terminology just because it's been used before, or is there a basis for it? And feminist theorists really emphasize that. So specifically, some techniques and strategies is empowerment, right? So we're, again, not giving voice, but empowering the existing voices and learning to check in with the self in that way. We are using self-disclosure to aid in that as well. Ethically speaking, of course, we're talking about gender role and social identity analysis. We're asking the client to dive with us deep and talk about ways that they have felt and seen different gender roles in their life, and which was helpful. What do they ascribe to and what do they not ascribe to? We're going to talk about gender role intervention and ways that we can intervene and break the ones that we don't ascribe to. And we're going to talk about positions of power and what it means to feel like you don't have power or control, and ways that we can work towards gaining that in certain areas. Assertiveness training, bibliotherapy, reframing, relabeling, social action group work, all of those are also skills and techniques to use. And you can see how it can be more long-term in nature because you're hitting many different areas that one may be more important to a client than another. And it gives you time to explore exactly what that is and then to create a game plan on a way to intervene effectively. And, again, some people say, well, I can't be a feminist, I'm a man, or I'm a male, or I'm not a female. And that couldn't be further from the truth. There is specifically a role and a place in feminist theory for men, especially. And the idea is that for men, if they're willing to accept a feminist theory and perspective, they're also willing to understand their own male privilege and what it means for them to have grown up in a society as a male rather than a female, and to confront perhaps existing biases that are within themselves. We all live with internalized bias and stigma, and the only way we can work through that is by talking about it. And part of it is redefining some of these traditional roles, such as masculinity and femininity, and being able to, again, give support and assistance in that way when working with someone who's not a man, right? Or even who is, and you just parallel that experience in therapy together. It's all about creating that idea of egalitarian relationships, right? Creating equal footing together and engaging specifically in supportive women efforts to create like a just society. So pretty much it's like a practice what you preach kind of thing. That's the benefit of feminist theory, is that it's very active, it's very engaged in the world. It's not just in the therapy room, it's in the world as a whole. It's really effective for groups too. Maintaining this can help support and be very effective for even more process groups, right? We're talking about our experience. We may have a prompt. It's not as skills-based as much as it's process-oriented. And it can help decrease those feelings of isolation and loneliness that, again, we mentioned that earlier for the individual therapist, but especially for a group therapist to talk about whether I'm a male or female, right? To talk about my experience living as a woman or my experience as a male in society, and being able to utilize a form of self-disclosure to model to your group members how to effectively analyze like what your own personal judgments or biases could be and can be, and doing so in a way that can help assist like the group members in learning how to do that, because that is a skill. Sorry. So, of course, this has many strengths from a diversity and multicultural perspective. It's one of the most common perspectives utilized for different cultural groups because of its collaborative nature. And it just can surpass a lot of time and generational differences because it ebbs and flows with the times too. Interestingly, some limitations go to the advocative piece when we're advocating for change in the social world. And that can be problematic when working with women who do not share these beliefs. So again, like you don't want to speak for the client when it comes to what, identifying as oppressive or not. But it can be challenging if you're working with a client who doesn't share in the same belief structure that follows a feministic principle or feministic perspective. And if therapists don't really understand and respect the cultural values of a client that they're bringing to you, they risk imposing their own values. And I mean, that just literally is the antithesis. It just goes completely against the purpose of what feminist theory does. Some contributions, gender-sensitive practices and awareness within the workplace, within our society, within culture, within schools. The emphasis on social change can lead to truly transforming society and has in different ways. It's got significant theoretical implications as well as within counseling, how to do things, because again, even the field of counseling and psychology, psychiatry too originated from a dominant cultural group that had practices in place that went unchecked for quite some time. And it wasn't until we had a multicultural perspective voice that brought awareness to saying, hey, some of these practices aren't effective for all cultural groups. Let's explore how it is not and what can be effective. And thus feminist theory was born. It talks about abuse to children. It talks about sexual harassment, domestic violence. Again, it brings support to voices that are commonly not supported in society and demands for attention to inequity in a way that is empowering, in a way that's inspiring for all of us, regardless of what your gender and identity is or expression is. And it can be incorporated into many other therapy models as well. You can be a feminist theory, a theorist, and also emotion focused. You can be a feminist theorist and also narrative focused. You can implement it alongside many other theories because it just enhances, in a way, what you're already doing. Again, some limitations goes into the bias if you're not actively aware of that specific bias within you. You can influence a client, and that's very unethical and has some legal implications as well. It calls to attention clients' unexamined choices, and they must honor client choices as long as these choices are informed, and that can create some tension and challenges. The contextual and environmental factors can detract away from like the personal experience in therapy. A lot of us see this during election times, during COVID-19, during the Black Lives Matter movement, during all these different experiences that we've lived through in the past 5 years or so, longer than that, that we become so involved and invested in what's going on in the larger culture, because like, how could we not when things are so important, that it can detract away from like exploring that intrapsychic domain, meaning like where I'm existing in it. Because maintaining a feminist theory perspective, it can be hard to find a balance between the world and my function in the world, if that makes sense. And finding a balance there is important. And so training, it's pretty non-systemic. There's not like specific steps, and we talked about how there's many things to focus on, but there's not like a guidebook, like a CBT orientation where it's like laid out in front of you. You sort of create that with a client. So that can be challenging because there's a lack of quality control in that way. So those are the 2 chapters. I ran through that a little on the quicker side, a little under an hour, but I think it's important to just give voice a little bit to what these chapters are talking about. If you guys have any questions, of course, feel free to shoot me a message, and just know that these theories can also be used hand in hand as well effectively. So thank you. Have a good day, everyone.